700 years before Jesus was born, a prophet wrote down the exact details of his death. Not vague symbolism, not poetic metaphor, specific forensic details. Pierced hands, silent before his accusers, crushed for the sins of others, buried in a rich man's tomb. Isaiah chapter 53 is the most dangerous prophecy in the entire Bible. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, scholars confirmed this text existed centuries before Christ ever walked the earth. No one could have edited it after the fact. No one could have planted it. Written before history happened. So the question becomes, how did Isaiah know? How could anyone describe a Roman crucifixion 7 centuries before Rome even invented it? Today, we are going verse by verse through Isaiah 53. And by the end of this video, you will never read this chapter the same way again. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God endures forever. Let's begin. The hidden chapter. Here is something most people do not know. Isaiah 53 is one of the most avoided chapters in traditional Jewish synagogue readings. For centuries, rabbinical traditions skipped over it. They read Isaiah 52, they read Isaiah 54, but chapter 53 was quietly left out of the weekly Haftarah cycle. Why? Because the description is too specific, too uncomfortable, too close to someone they did not want it to be about. The words point to a suffering Messiah that contradicts what many expected. You see, in the first century, most Jewish leaders expected a conquering king, a military deliverer who would overthrow Rome. But Isaiah painted a completely different picture. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, despised and rejected. This was not the Messiah they wanted, and that tension between expectation and prophecy is exactly where the power of Isaiah 53 lies. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. The prophet was not describing a warrior, he was describing a sacrifice. And that changes everything about how we read what comes next. The Dead Sea Proof. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something shatter. Inside those caves at Qumran, archaeologists discovered over 900 ancient manuscripts, including the Great Isaiah Scroll. Undeniable, this scroll dates to approximately 125 BC, more than a century before Jesus was born. And when scholars compared it to the modern Hebrew text of Isaiah, they found it was virtually identical, word for word. Chapter 53 was right there, fully intact. No additions, no alterations. This is critical because skeptics have long argued that Christians edited Old Testament prophecies after the fact to match the life of Jesus. The Dead Sea Scrolls destroyed that argument completely. The text predates Christ. The prophecy was already written, already circulating, already being read. If this prophetic portrait of Isaiah 53 is opening your eyes to something you have never seen before, hit like and subscribe for more biblical wisdom that transforms, because what comes next will take your breath away. The details Isaiah described are not general, they are surgical, and we are about to go through them one by one. Pierced and crushed. Isaiah 53 verse 5 says, "He was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities." Pierced, crushed for us. Now think about this. When Isaiah wrote these words around 700 BC, crucifixion did not exist. The Persians would develop an early form of it centuries later. The Romans would perfect it as a method of execution even later than that. Yet Isaiah describes piercing, not stoning, which was the standard Jewish method of execution, not beheading, not burning, piercing. The Hebrew word used is chalal, meaning to bore through, to wound fatally by penetration. How does a prophet describe a method of death that has not been invented yet? And the word crushed, daka in Hebrew, means to be utterly broken, pulverized. Medical research on crucifixion confirms that the process literally crushes the body. The weight of the victim's own frame slowly collapses the lungs. The heart gives out under catastrophic strain. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. Isaiah was describing crucifixion with medical precision 700 years before anyone had ever seen one. But this is only the beginning of the forensic details. Silent before accusers. Verse 7 of Isaiah 53 contains one of the most psychologically stunning details in the entire prophecy. It says he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. The accused chose silence when speaking, could have saved his life. Now put yourself in that moment. You are standing before the most powerful political and religious authorities of your time. They are accusing you falsely. You have the ability to speak. You could defend yourself. You could expose their lies. And yet, you say nothing. The Gospels record this exact scene. When Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, Pilate was astonished. He said, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And Matthew 27:14 tells us Jesus gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Silent lamb slaughter. Isaiah did not just predict what would happen to the Messiah's body. He predicted what the Messiah would choose to do with his voice. And that silence spoke louder than any defense ever could. But there is another detail that defies all probability. The rich man's tomb. Isaiah 53 verse 9 makes a prediction so specific it almost sounds impossible. It says he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Impossible. Think about what Isaiah is saying. This suffering servant would die among criminals, but be buried with the wealthy. In the ancient world, that combination was virtually unheard of. Criminals were thrown into mass graves or left to rot. They were not given honorable burials. They were certainly not placed in rich men's tombs, yet that is precisely what happened. Jesus was crucified between two thieves, assigned a grave with the wicked. And then Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, went to Pilate and asked for the body. He placed Jesus in his own new tomb, cut from rock. The rich man Joseph gave his own tomb to a condemned criminal. Fulfilling a 700-year-old prophecy he may not have even known existed. Wicked rich death burial. The mathematical probability of one person fulfilling even a handful of these details by coincidence is staggering. But we are far from finished, because what Isaiah says next gets even more personal. Bearing our sickness. Verse 4 contains a truth that most people rush past without realizing what it actually says. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. He carried what was never his to carry, so that we would not have to. The Hebrew word for pain here is koli, and it literally means sickness, disease, grief. The word for suffering is makab, anguish, both physical and emotional. Isaiah is saying the servant would absorb human suffering into himself, not just moral guilt, not just spiritual penalty, actual pain, actual grief, actual sickness. And here is the part that cuts deep. The people watching him suffer assumed God was punishing him. They thought he deserved it. They looked at his agony and concluded he must have done something wrong. The very people he was dying for mocked him while he bled. Isaiah predicted not just the suffering itself, but the cruel misunderstanding of those who witnessed it. The crowd would get it completely wrong, and 2,000 years later, many still do. But there is a verse that reveals the purpose behind all of it. The guilt offering. Verse 10 is where the theology of Isaiah 53 reaches its deepest point. It says the Lord makes his life an offering for sin. In Hebrew, an asham. Asham, guilt offering. Now this word is not random. The asham was a very specific sacrifice in the Levitical system described in Leviticus 5. It was the guilt offering, the sacrifice required when someone had committed a trespass that damaged what was sacred. It required full restitution plus a penalty. The animal had to be without blemish. And Isaiah is saying this servant, this man of sorrows, would become that offering, not a burnt offering, not a grain offering, a guilt offering. He would pay the full debt, plus the penalty for every sin ever committed. This is substitutionary atonement stated with crystal clarity 7 centuries before the cross. The servant does not just suffer. He does not just die. He pays. He restores. He settles the account between God and humanity. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And that last phrase, prolong his days, points to something beyond death, which brings us to the most shocking detail of all, life after death. Isaiah 53 does not end at the grave, and this is where most people miss the climax of the entire prophecy. Verse 10 says after his suffering, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Verse 11 says, by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many. Verse 12 says he will divide the spoils with the strong. Risen. Read that again. After his suffering, after being pierced, crushed, silent, killed, and buried, he sees life, he acts, he justifies, he receives reward. Death, life, justify many. Isaiah is describing someone who dies and then continues to live and work. In 700 BC, the concept of bodily resurrection was not a common theological expectation. The ancient Near Eastern worldview generally saw death as final. Sheol was the end. Yet here, embedded in this prophetic poem, is a man who suffers, dies, and then, impossibly, lives again to see the fruit of his sacrifice. The prophecy does not just predict death, it predicts victory over death itself. And this is precisely what the apostles proclaimed. He was buried, he rose, he lives. Isaiah saw it 700 years before it happened. But who was Isaiah really writing about? That question has sparked one of the oldest debates in biblical history: Israel or Messiah. Some scholars argue that Isaiah 53 is not about an individual at all. They say the suffering servant represents the nation of Israel, suffering on behalf of the nations. And to be fair, Isaiah does refer to Israel as God's servant in other chapters. But when you examine the text closely, this interpretation breaks down. The servant in Isaiah 53 suffers for the sins of others, but Israel was punished for its own sins. Verse 8 says he was cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of my people. Who is my people if the servant is Israel? Israel cannot be cut off for the transgression of Israel. That is circular logic. Verse 9 says he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. That cannot describe a nation with a long biblical record of disobedience and idolatry. Innocent, sinless, blameless. And verse 10 says his life is made a guilt offering. Nations do not become guilt offerings. Individuals do, lambs do. The text itself demands a singular, sinless, sacrificial figure, not a collective. Every detail in Isaiah 53 points to one person, and one person alone. Even some ancient Jewish commentaries, including the Babylonian Talmud and the Targum Jonathan, applied this passage to the Messiah. The reinterpretation away from Messiah came later, largely in response to Christian claims. And that brings us to the final, most devastating detail: the impossible odds. Let us step back and look at the full picture. Isaiah 53 predicts that the Messiah would be rejected by his own people, that he would suffer silently, that he would be pierced, not stoned or beheaded, that he would be killed alongside criminals, that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb, that he would bear the sins and sickness of others, that his death would serve as a guilt offering, and that after dying, he would live again. 1. Rejected by his people. 2. Silent before accusers. 3. Pierced, not stoned. 4. Buried with the rich. 5. Rose after death. Mathematician Peter Stoner calculated the probability of just 8 messianic prophecies being fulfilled by one person by chance. The result, 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That is a 1 followed by 17 zeros. And Isaiah 53 alone contains far more than 8 specific predictions. This is not coincidence. This is not creative interpretation. This is a text that was sealed in a cave, preserved for 2,000 years, and verified by modern archaeology. For prophecy never had its origin in the human will. But prophets, though human, spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. Either Isaiah was the luckiest guesser in human history, or he was shown something by someone who exists outside of time. Isaiah 53 is not just a chapter. It is a courtroom exhibit. It is a fingerprint left at the scene of the greatest rescue in human history. Written 7 centuries before the rescue took place, every verse, every detail, every word points to a singular, suffering, sinless servant who would take the punishment we deserved, die in our place, and then rise again to see the fruit of his sacrifice. Written before, fulfilled after. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the text. History confirms the events, and the Spirit confirms the truth in the hearts of those who are willing to see it. This is not religion. This is evidence. This is a God who told you what he would do, and then did it. The question is no longer whether Isaiah 53 points to Jesus. The question is, what will you do with that truth? If you made it this far, comment Isaiah 53 fulfilled to show that this prophecy opened your eyes to something you cannot unsee. Stay in the Word, stay in the Spirit, and watch what God does. If this blessed you, subscribe for more. Share this with someone who needs to see these prophecies. See you in the next one.